Hey, welcome back to the Wells Family Home Group. Listen, today we're going to recap last week's message, and it's Acts 15 and 16. So if you weren't with us, or if you're just curious about what we're going over, this is for you. So we see in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas are in a place called Antioch, and they're working with the church there, and a big debate arises between the Jewish Christians there and Paul and Barnabas. See, these Jews believe that in order to really be a Christian, you should be circumcised. That didn't sit well with Paul and Barnabas, so a big debate erupts. And Paul and Barnabas decide, you know what, we should probably take this back to the apostles and the elders in the church in Jerusalem and let them decide. And let's see what church doctrine is going to be and what, the experts think about it. So they travel back to Antioch. And in verses 2 through 5, we see that when they presented it to the church, all the Christians there in Jerusalem that used to be Pharisees stand up, and what do you think they say? Remember, the Pharisees were experts in the law. So the Pharisees stand up and say, oh yes, you should definitely be circumcised if you're a Christian. Well, there was, a lot more debate that happened there in the church in Jerusalem about it. Well, finally, Peter stands up, and in verses 7 through 11, he speaks. And one of the questions that he poses to the crowd is, why do you insist on putting a heavy yoke on the necks of the disciples? In other words, new Christians. And he said, why would we put a yoke on them that we ourselves couldn't bear? So Peter's saying, look, we weren't that good at following the law ourselves. Why are we trying to thrust it on new Christians? That was a real solid question. So then we see in verse 12 a little bit of a break in the action because Paul and Barnabas give what we in the new church would call a missionary update, right? Surely you've had a missionary come to your church and give one of these updates about the country where they work. Well, that's exactly what Paul and Barnabas did. They talked about all of the Gentiles that were being led to Jesus in places like Antioch. After the missionary update, a guy named James steps in, and he speaks in verses 13 through 21, and he talks about the law and the requirements. And, James kind of fell right in where Peter left off about why that wasn't a great idea. So after James speaks, the apostles and the elders rule on this, and they decide that, circumcision, why would you need to be circumcised to be a Christian? Only one thing's required to be a Christian, that's right, faith in Jesus Christ. They decide to send Paul and Barnabas a letter to take to the rest of the churches signed by the apostles and the elders there. And this letter lays out a couple of things. It says, first of all, circumcision is not a requirement. But they said a couple of things you should steer clear from. They say food sacrificed to idols. You should steer clear from that. Don't eat meat from strangled animals. And we talked last week about how if you strangle an animal, you can't properly bleed it. So the meat still has a lot of blood in it. And finally, number 3, abstain from sexual immorality. Now, the reason they listed those first two things was because these were also a really big sticking point for Jews because of the Romans' habit of sacrificing meat to idols and then sell it in the open market for a little bit less than what regular meat costs. So I think they probably, and this is Charlie's best guess on why they included those two things, probably because it was super offensive to the other Jews in the Christian church. So we talked last week about how Paul later on says in Romans that, Paul talks about food sacrificed to idols in the book of Romans, and he says it's not really that big a deal. He said, an idol's nothing to me but a carved piece of wood or stone. It's not God or a God. It's just a thing. But he said, but if I have a brother and that bothers him, then I'm not going to eat the meat because he said, if eating that meat causes my brother to stumble, I'll never eat meat again. So we'll talk more about that in Romans, but just understand that's likely the reason these two things were included in that letter. So don't worry about circumcision. Do avoid blood. Do avoid strangled animals, and do avoid sexual immorality. So finally, Paul and Barnabas set off, and they head right back to Antioch. Now they get back there, and on the way, they're reading this letter to everybody. There's a lot of rejoicing. More people are led to Jesus every time they stop at a church. And finally, when they get back, we see in verses 32 through 33 that there are two prophets there in Antioch helping Paul and Barnabas out, two guys named Judas and Silas. And they're, encouraging the believers there and helping them to grow as well. And we see that Silas ends up remaining with Paul and helping Paul out. Now, it is in verse 36 that we see something odd happen. Paul and Barnabas get into an argument. Barnabas wants to invite a guy named John Mark to continue on with their journeys. You may remember John Mark because John Mark left Paul and Barnabas right before Paul was stoned. We don't know why that he left, but he left Paul and Barnabas and went to do something else. And whatever he did and why ever he left, Paul was angry about it, and they couldn't agree on John Mark. So what happens is Barnabas teams up with John Mark, and they head on to an island called Cyprus, which we discussed last week. And then Paul and Silas becomes Paul's new traveling companion. Paul and Silas go through Syria, and they end up in Cilicia. So that's where we end up in chapter 15. And what I'll cover next with you is chapter 16. Okay, so brace yourself for Acts chapter 16, because this is where Paul gets a little bit spicy. And I had a little bit of a laugh last week because of some of the things that we see Paul do and say in Acts chapter 16. But in Acts 16, it opens up, and we see that Paul and Silas are in Derbe and Lystra. Now, if those two places sound familiar, it's because that's where Paul was stoned. And this is the second time we've seen Paul return there. So Paul, he ain't afraid. He ain't scared. He'll go back. And I'll tell you, we don't see anybody mess with Paul this time either. Would you? The dude was stoned dead. He comes back twice. He don't sweat these cats. So Paul goes back with Silas. And they meet a guy named Timothy. So in verses 1 and 2 in Acts 16, you see a little bit about Timothy. And one thing that verse 2 tells us is that Timothy enjoyed a good reputation among the church there. Now, Timothy wanted to serve with Paul, and Paul acknowledged that. So what Paul does before Timothy serves, because there were a lot of Jews in the area, Timothy's mom was a Jew, but his dad was a Greek. And because his dad was a Greek, Timothy wasn't circumcised. So because he was going to be ministering to Jews, Paul had him circumcised. Now, wait a second. Paul just hand-carried a letter all the way back from Jerusalem, signed by the apostles and the elders, explaining that circumcision wasn't a requirement for salvation. That's weird. But you know what? Timothy didn't get circumcised to be saved. Timothy got circumcised to witness to other Jews in the area. So later on in one of his epistles, Paul says that he became all things to all men. In other words, Paul became familiar with the things that the folks he was ministering to were familiar. And Paul knew that if Timothy wanted to be effective in ministering to Jews, he kind of had to adopt some Jewish stuff, right? Because their faith was probably a little weaker than Timothy's. So we see Timothy circumcised in verse 3. And then in verses 4 through 5, we see that Paul, Timothy, and Silas go spreading the gospel all around to the churches there. And a lot of people are saved. Now, they're really firing up places, man. They're going everywhere, talking to everybody. And then something weird happens. They start going to all these churches in Asia. And everywhere they go, the Holy Spirit says, nope. You're not spreading your testimony here. You're not witnessing here. Keep going. Nope, you're not doing it here. Nope, you're not doing it here. And then one night, as they're trying to figure out why it is that they can't, spread the gospel in Asia, Paul has a vision. And in this vision, he sees a Macedonian man pleading with him to come and spread the gospel in Macedonia. Now, if you want to know where Macedonia is, it's actually a place today on the map. In fact, you can still find the word Macedonia. It's a country. But as I mentioned last week, it's actually where Alexander the Great, his dad was from Macedonia. In fact, his dad's name was Philip, and tonight we're going to read about a city called Philippi, named after Philip, Alexander's dad. So there you go, that's Macedonia. So when Paul tells the others about the dream, man, they immediately take off, and they go to Macedonia to witness. In verses 11 through 15, we see that Paul meets a lady there named Lydia in Philippi, and she's from a city called Thyatira, and she sells purple cloth. She's a linen dealer, and she wants to become a Christian, and her whole household are baptized, and kind of a big deal, right? And we see a lot of folks like that in the New Testament. When one of them gets baptized, the whole family gets baptized. They all buy into Jesus. And after that, we see that Paul and Silas are walking down the road, and there's a demon-possessed girl that keeps following them. And she keeps following them, and the demon inside her starts yelling out as Paul and Silas are walking down the road, "These men are sent from God Most High. These men are servants of God," right? And the demon keeps mocking them. So finally, Paul turns around and he says, "Hey, would you stop? Knock it off." And then he casts the demon out of the girl. Well, here's the problem with this. This girl, this demon that she had, enabled her to see the future. Now, this was a slave girl, and her owners made tons of money on her fortune telling, right? So once they cast the demon out of her, her owners figured out they couldn't make money on her anymore because she couldn't tell the future. So they were furious. So they went to the magistrate and they told about Paul and Silas. And they said, look, here's what happened. Here's what's been going on. And here's what they tell the magistrates. They say, these men, being Jews, are stirring up trouble in our city. Now here's the problem. Paul was a Roman citizen, and Silas was very likely a Roman citizen. But they didn't ask Paul and Silas if they were just regular old Jews or if they were Roman citizens. They just leveled an accusation. So the magistrates also, without asking any questions, in verse 22, man, they have Paul and Silas beaten with rods, just whipped down to parade rest. They beat the time out of them. And then in verse 23, they imprison them. Now, back then, you couldn't just do stuff like that to a Roman citizen. Being a citizen was a really big deal. Well, Paul and Silas get thrown into prison. Now, they're in prison, and it's about midnight, and they're praying and they're singing hymns, and all the other inmates are listening to them, and they're chained together, and they're praying and singing, and a great earthquake happens, and all the jail cells burst open. Well, when the jailer sees what's happened, he grabs a sword and he's about to kill himself because, he's responsible for all his prisoners. If they escape, it's on him. He's about to kill himself, and Paul yells out, he says, wait, don't do it. We're here. And the Philippian jailer runs in, and he kind of asks Paul, he's like, hey man, what's this about? And Paul's able to share the gospel with this guy. And you know what happened? The jailer and his entire family came to Jesus. Man, is that crazy or what? So all this time, if they'd been in churches in Asia spreading the gospel, this Philippian jailer may have never come to know Jesus. Now, we don't know what he did with the rest of his life, but we know God called Paul and Silas there for a reason. Now, here's the funny part. Here's where Paul gets spicy. So the next day, the magistrates decide, okay, they've suffered enough. We beat them. They've spent a night or two in jail. Let's go ahead and turn them loose. So the magistrate sends word to the jailer, hey, turn these guys loose. So the jailer unlocks the door and says, hey, you guys are free to go. The magistrate said, you're good. Paul says this. He says, oh, no. You beat me, a Roman citizen, and imprisoned me with no trial? Are you crazy? All right, maybe he didn't say that last part. This paper's killing me. Maybe he didn't say that last part, but he definitely was indignant that they had beaten him with no trial. So here's what Paul did say. He said, let them come out themselves and get us out. So Paul says, man, if them magistrates want me out of here, they're going to have to come and tell me to get out. And guess what? The magistrate came, and it says, Acts 40 says, then they came and pleaded with them. They said, Paul, please leave. They were very polite about it. Now, this might sound like a strange story, but later on, Paul's going to use his citizenship as a Roman to go spread the gospel to Caesar's own household. So stay tuned. We're going to see that happen later on. Hey, listen, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you come back and join us for actual home group. Talk to you soon. 9, they say, yeah, we agree. There's probably no reason to be circumcised. You should probably take this back to the apostles. I swear, back to Antioch and to all the churches in Asia. Daggone it. Come on, man.